Okay, continue.
So, welcome everyone. I'm pleased to let you know that once again, I am not going to be just shouting at my laptop for an hour. I've arranged to speak to one of the authors that we've been reading this week, namely Jason DeCruz. Jason is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Albany, which is in upstate New York. It's part of the state of New York university system, SUNY. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So to get started, I thought it might be interesting to reflect a little bit on this advertising campaign that has been going on in New York, at least in New York City, for like a decade or more. The "if you see something, say something" campaign. There's signs enjoining people to do this on the subway, and it's kind of a council of distrust and suspicion. Kind of, I guess, arose after 9/11, which is strange in its own right because 9/11 didn't happen on the subway, but it sort of tells people to trust their own feelings of distrust or trust their own feelings of suspicion. And I wonder, what you think about making this a public campaign and how that relates to what you talked about in this paper about humble trust.
That's a really interesting question. And I haven't thought about this. So the "if you see something, say something" campaign. And does that kind of prime us to distrust other people and think that, it's all right to have as a first inclination or impulse to distrust other people? So on the one hand, I have to say, I've never, until you brought it up today, the campaign has never seemed nefarious to me. Or at least, the slogan has never seemed particularly nefarious. Because I imagine in cases like, you see abandoned luggage on a train, and you ought to report it. And instead of just going through your day and not really caring very much about other people's safety, you kind of take responsibility for the group by reporting things like that. And so originally when I heard it, I thought about thinking, well, this is kind of a good thing. It's a kind of enjoining us to take responsibility for the group safety by not sort of walking blindly through our day and paying attention to things that might be off. And the kind of things you might see also could be, people in distress. You see someone who appears to need help or appears to be being forced or coerced by someone either to go somewhere or to follow them, then you should say something and ask them if they're okay. And if it doesn't feel like they're able to answer that question, then you should try to get some further help. So those all seem to be good things that you want to do. On the other hand, I think that you're right that whether the something that you see is in fact suspicious, or whether it's just what I see is a group of young African American men who are just hanging out on some benches inside the subway, and that's what's suspicious to me, right? They're not doing anything. Why are they sitting on those benches? A couple of trains have passed by and they haven't got on the train. Or, I see someone in Islamic clothing or garb, and I just think, why are they behaving the way they're behaving? They let a train go by without going on it. And I think, why didn't they get on the train? And there's obviously many innocent explanations for why they're doing that. Maybe they're waiting for a friend, so they get on the train together. And those kinds of suspicions do seem like they could be quite damaging. And reporting those kinds of suspicions do seem like they could be quite bad. And all this sort of recent problems of people who are napping while black, where completely innocent behavior is perceived as being suspicious, and then people call the police on them. Yeah, that all does seem to be really problematic. And if that's the kind of behavior that is incited by the advertising campaign, yeah, I do see it as problematic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, as you say, there is a known problem of sort of unresponsive bystanders. So like when someone is in distress, it often happens, especially if there's a crowd, that like the first few people, if none of them intervenes, then everyone else sort of assumes that everything is fine.
Right.
And so you might think, well, it's good to sort of take responsibility for yourself and to look out for your community and intervene even though others aren't. But I guess the question is like, how much should we trust our own suspicions? How much should we trust our own sense of danger or of emergency? And if we are systematically going to be sensing danger or threat when it's not there, then this kind of, if you see something, say something campaign could be quite dangerous.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, but there's this very difficult problem of distrusting your own intuitions and distrusting your own impulses. Where on the one hand, yes, you probably are being affected by all sorts of biases in and these feelings are generated by processes that are influenced by racism, by sexism, by biases towards people of, in particular, religious groups. But then, on the other hand, when someone makes a tragic mistake and something really dangerous and suspicious is going on, and they fail to say something, or they fail to protect themselves, that's something that can be really dangerous. I mean, kind of a poignant question that I got from a colleague of mine, Bonnie Steinbach, was, all this business about humble trust. When your daughter grows up to be a teenager, you're going to step back from that and you're going to tell her to trust her suspicions and to trust that inner voice rather than to ignore it. And I feel the pull of that as well. But there's something about sort of being alive to the damage that distrust does, being alive to the signals of disrespect that distrust can send, being alive to the marginalization of groups as a result of distrust. And then thinking through really what the risks are, and being quite conscious of, like, am I really at risk in the situation? Are others really at risk in the situation? What are the costs that the other people will bear of my signals and my expressions of distrust towards them? And so part of what I'm trying to do in the paper is just to reevaluate thinking about trust always as the safe option, distrust always as the safe option, and trust as the risky option, because sometimes other people bear the costs of our distrust. And so being alive to others bearing the cost of our distrust is, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's something you addressed later in the paper as well. I wasn't sure we were going to get to this right away, but you bring up this issue that like people who are more well off, who are more secure, who have more prosperity, can afford various kinds of losses, are better in a position to trust in a risky way. And I guess this example with, your colleague telling you, well, your teenage daughter should be more distrustful, is pointing to the fact that like sometimes threats are existential or at least extremely bad. And so if it's a matter of losing $50 versus a matter of being assaulted, right, then
That's right.
There's a reason why we might be more cautious in one situation than the other.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I think that I was actually on that point. I was inspired by a paper of yours, where when you talk about making these kind of experiments in trust, and how it's much easier to make these kinds of experiments in trust when you have less to lose. But when you're more vulnerable, the losses that you would bear are greater. And so we should expect of people who are less vulnerable that they make more experiments in trust because they're more able to. And we should expect of people who are more vulnerable that they needn't bear these the same level of risk of people who are more privileged or more secure along those different kinds of dimensions.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. It's interesting because there's kind of an analogy in the economics of poverty and also just in like finance and investing more generally. So like if I've only got $100, then it doesn't make sense for me to make a bet where I have a 60% chance to double my money and a 40% chance to lose it all. But if I've got $100,000, then it might make sense for me to risk $100 in that way, because if I do that enough times, then I'm going to end up making money overall.
Right.
But I can sort of afford the variance. You actually talked about variance. I forget who you were quoting in the paper, where it's like, trusting is a riskier strategy in the sense that like you can get betrayed, but if you trust you overall in the long term, as long as you don't die, then you're likely to be better off. This is quite interesting to me because it suggests that there's like an inextricable connection between prosperity on the one hand and the reasonability of expecting people to trust.
Yeah. Right. So we can only ask of people who are relatively secure and privileged to take these risks of trust. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be right. Although, I mean, people are more or less privileged along very many different kinds of dimensions, right? And so it might be that, with respect to money, you might be very underprivileged, but with respect to having had good friendships, you're very privileged. And so you can take certain kinds of personal risks on other people where a personal betrayal wouldn't be a catastrophe for you because you had this secure, you've been securely attached growing up, and you have this group of friends around you who you really have faith in, and so you can take certain kinds of risks with regard to friendship that you can't make with regard to money. And then there might be someone who is really wealthy and is able to make certain risks, take certain risks with regard to money, but not with regard to friendship. So I wouldn't want to say, so although I would agree that we can only expect that people take risks in proportion to their privilege, that it's not as if privilege is only along one dimension, and we can just understand all people as either more or less privileged along this single dimension. Many different dimensions of trust, many different dimensions of privilege.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a good point. I guess one of the interesting things I found in the paper was the shift in perspective from most everything in the literature is like talking to someone who is figuring out whom to trust. That makes a certain amount of sense. It's the perspective that Craig takes in his social epistemology book, which says like the reason we have our concept of knowledge is that we're constantly trying to figure out whom to trust about what's true. That certainly is one perspective. But in the paper, you kind of turn things around and you ask about the perspective of someone who's like trying to be trusted or expects to be trusted. Why do you think that's been so neglected?
I mean, I think I have some ideas about it, and I think partly it might be just the fact that moral philosophy is mostly written by people in positions of privilege, and especially by white people, and that the experience of being baselessly distrusted is maybe not as salient to people in this group. Whereas I think to any person of color, at least in the United States, who has had the experience of like going shopping and having the shop owner walk around behind them suspiciously, this is a really, really common experience. And also the experience of just trying to telegraph to people that, hey, I'm trustworthy, I'm not a danger to you, I'm not going to steal from you. I think this is not such a common experience of the people who write, the groups of people who write moral philosophy. And so maybe that's not something that we hear about as much in the philosophy of trust. But yeah, I think that's at least a hypothesis about why we hear less about that. But I think there really should be more written about the position of being trusted in an unwarranted way, and just the impossible situation of the person who finds themselves trusted in an unwarranted way. Because
So you mean distrusted?
Distrusted. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Thank you. Distrusted unwarrantedly, because it's such an impossible position to try to have to prove your distrust, your trustworthiness, because any attempt that is detected as an attempt to show trustworthiness can just as easily be detected as a duplicitous or deceptive thing to be doing.
Manipulative, yeah.
Manipulative, right. Acting, deliberately acting in a particular kind of way. So the person who's baselessly distrusted is put in this very, very practically difficult position that I think is, on the one hand, it's very unfortunate, but it's also very interesting philosophically. That's part of what got me to write the paper in the first place.
That's interesting. Isn't there, I forget who he is now. I think he's at Stanford maybe, or Berkeley, this guy who wrote about whistling Vivaldi while walking around, because the idea was like, oh, I can signal to people that like I'm a very sophisticated and educated person by whistling classical music as I walk around, and then they won't make these nasty inferences about me.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I know the exact reference, but so when I was an undergraduate student at Yale, and one thing I noticed is that a huge proportion of African American men and women students at Yale wear Yale paraphernalia a lot, and it's not because of their love for the institution. It's really because they're signaling that they're supposed to be there. That they have a place there, that they shouldn't be looked upon with suspicion. And I think it's a kind of similar idea.
Yeah. That's interesting. So I guess one question that arose for me, the course that I'm teaching right now is primarily about epistemic trust. And a lot of that literature involves basically like, someone makes an assertion to you, do you believe that what they asserted is true? Which is a fairly narrow conception of trust, though obviously an important one. And your paper is about trust sort of more broadly, especially practical trust, trusting people to do things or not do things. do you think that there's a connection between these two? Is epistemic trust maybe like a species of generic trust or something else?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a connection, and I think thinking about epistemic trust as as a species of this more general kind of trust um, is useful. I think that there's this huge bias in the trust literature of thinking about the primary function of trust as the extension of agency. And this is something that goes kind of almost unquestioned. And I see it all over the place where people sort of assume that the reason why we need trust in the first place is to become more powerful agents. It's kind of an agency fetish across philosophy that I see. And I think that trust is so much more expansive than just making us more powerful agents. Like we can't be at home in the world unless we have basic trust of other people. That is, we can't feel safe, we can't feel secure, we can't form relationships. It's not always about finding helpmates for projects that I'm trying to carry out that I need trust for. Like I have all these plans and now I'm trying to like work other people into them and I need to be able to rely on them in the right kinds of ways. That's one reason why trust is important and a really important reason why trust is important. But there's this other thing that I think is just as, if not more important, which is just feeling safe and secure in the world and also being able to form meaningful relationships with other people without being defensive. And I wonder if I know the epistemology of trust literature less. And I wonder if there's something analogous to that in the epistemology of trust literature, or whether when it comes to just like forming beliefs about what people, based on what people say, if that really is more just about gaining knowledge and expanding agency rather than the concerns with security and relationship that have kind of driven the way I've been thinking about trust. So maybe there's a
Interesting. I mean, so
disparity there. I don't know.
Duncan Pritchard has written a bit about what he calls epistemic anxiety, which is this notion that sort of once you recognize that there is no secure foundation in the way that Descartes might have wanted, that you could turn out to be wrong about virtually anything. There's a kind of anxiety that comes with that because you're constantly thinking like, okay, well, I've got this set of beliefs and then I've got those perceptions and like, should I pit them against each other? Is one of them deceiving me and the other trustworthy? Are they both wrong? Which is maybe a way of not feeling at home in the epistemic dimension of the world. But for him, it's still very, still largely individualistic. And I guess what you're pointing to is something more social where you need to feel at home with other people.
Right.
I guess there's this sense in which you might think like, well, what if everyone's always lying to me? Like I'm in the Truman Show or the Matrix or any of these dystopian worlds. That would be, I guess, epistemic counterpart to what you're mentioning.
That might be right. Yeah. And maybe, I mean, in personal relationships, if you're constantly suspicious of, what your close friends or partners are telling you, that is the source of a deep kind of anxiety as well. And it's really hard to live a halfway decent life with that kind of anxiety. And so, yeah, there again, even the epistemic form of trust is required for this even halfway decent life. In the same way as this more practical trust is also required for an even halfway decent life, which is just more foundational, I think, than the point about agency, trust to get things done.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that kept popping up for me as I was reading through your paper is there's kind of in the background, like Descartes' method of doubt, and then the Clifford James debate about the ethics of belief. So like in the Meditations, Descartes at one point says like, I should never trust my senses if they deceive me even once. Which is like the ultimate method of doubt. It's like the most suspicious you can be is never trust anything that either has deceived you once or could deceive you at all.
Right.
And you know, in the Clifford and James debate, James points out that like there's sort of these two dueling maxims. On the one hand, I want to believe as many things that are true as possible. And I also want to not believe things when they're false. And you could easily satisfy either one of these without the other. So if you just believe everything, then you believe all things that are true, but you also have tons of false beliefs.
Right.
And if you believe nothing, then you don't have any false beliefs, but you don't have any true beliefs either. So it's this kind of negotiation of the trade-off between those and the sort of risk sensitivity that's involved that seems to be playing out in your paper, but also in a lot of this literature.
I think that's right. I think there's often a kind of hidden assumption that we ought to economize on trust. And so if we can get something, if we can achieve something, or if we can gain some kind of knowledge without requiring trust, then we should use as little trust as possible in realizing our ends and in figuring out what is true. And I mean, I think that that's just kind of, it's an impossible way to live. It's just, it's not very good advice for being the sort of person who values relationships with other people. And it also kind of builds in this presumption that betrayal is always a catastrophe. And this is also something that I was trying to address in the paper, that so there's in the psychology literature, this is literature on betrayal aversion, where betrayal is, so having your, so losing a bet is bad enough, but losing a bet because someone exploits you is just far, far worse than that. And so people are very unwilling to make bets, make risky bets because of the specter of being exploited. So it's not just about the money that you're going to lose, but it's just about the terribleness of being exploited. And I think that there's a really common tendency to see every time that trust is not met, to see that as an instance of exploitation or catastrophic betrayal. Because we have this strong tendency to see everything is about us, to take everything personally. And sometimes the reason why trust is not met is just that somebody isn't paying attention, or that it's not about you at all. It's just about, say, a lack of attention or a lack of competence in a particular kind of field. And often, the reason why someone has failed to meet your trust is, not that they're thinking about you and that they want to demean you or humiliate you or put you down, or they don't care enough about you. It's just that they're not thinking at all. They're just not paying attention. And I think there's kind of a virtue to being able to see that. I was talking to Nomi Arpale just a few days ago about whether or not, is there a moral virtue to not taking things personally? And if so, what would we call that virtue? We don't seem to have really apt ways of describing it yet. But I do think there's a way of being a good truster where you don't take every instance of people not meeting your trust as an instance of exploitation or a betrayal. And you're alive to the possibility that they're simply not paying attention, or they're simply distracted by something else, or they're simply incompetent in a particular kind of way. And if you're able to do that, then when your trust is not met, it's not always going to be a catastrophe. It'll just be, a point of data. I can't trust this person to keep gossip to themselves when they get tipsy. And it's not because they have a low opinion of me that they betrayed my confidence. It's just that when this person gets tipsy, they talk too much. And now I know that. And so I'm not going to trust them with juicy gossip anymore. Now, I may still totally trust them to have my back when I need them to have my back. And so I'm not going to be so angry and betrayed that I need to disavow any trust in them whatsoever. But I've just gained a piece of information about the ways in which they can and cannot be trusted. And that doesn't destroy the relationship, and that doesn't preclude the possibility of future trusting in other domains.
That's super interesting. I mean, so a couple of things. I have a proposal, which is that this not taking things personally or not taking things too seriously might be related to having a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
Or irony or something along those lines.
I totally see at least correlated with a good sense of humor. Maybe yeah,
because you can kind of laugh it off and just be like, well, that's life. So I think that might be interesting, but to follow up on the main point you were making, it seems to me like this is again related back to having enough security that you can deal with being let down or betrayed. I guess let down is easier than betrayed. And I guess the pandemic in a way has sort of forced me to recognize this. So for the past 2 years, I've been trying to edit a book, and there are 20 people who are supposed to write chapters for this book.
Oh my God.
And each of them is also supposed to write a commentary on on one of the others. So you can imagine one of them got COVID, as did her husband, as did her father-in-law. One of them got hit by a car, had a concussion, hasn't been able to work for months. And it was every time I gave them a deadline, a lot of them missed it. And at a certain point, I was just shrug, right? This is life. This is how things go. I'm not going to get angry at these people. Some of them seemed like they were just, taking advantage of the fact that they could get away with stuff, but I don't know their lives. Maybe they were too embarrassed to admit what was really going on. And, we've all been suffering for quite a while now. And I can see why someone would be reluctant to, give me that information when I'm more or less a stranger to them. I'm just, some guy who emailed them, and they might not have even met me in person. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right that that it's a bit overly dramatic to call these betrayals of trust. But I trusted people to do things. They promised they would. They even signed a contract, which I guess is legally binding or something. But I'm not going to hold it against them. Right. I think, if it were a matter of life and death, then that would be quite different. But say we need to be able to proportion our responses to being let down when we trust people based on how important and timely and emergent the issue is.
I think that's right. I think it's also connected to having a disposition to see trust as more ecological. So to see that the circumstances of the very specific kind of circumstances of a particular kind of promise or commitment that another person has are going to play a large role in whether or not they keep or break that commitment. And so, it might be that, you're getting all these commitments and promises for people to send their papers to you by such and such date. And then you see like one after another is breaking this commitment, breaking this promise. And, there might be sort of subtle ways in which you can like shore up people's willpower, motivate them to be on time, or at least to give signals when they're going to be late. And I think that not seeing each failure of trust or failure of trustworthiness as a personal affront is kind of connected with seeing trust as more ecological, thinking that, the situation is really powerful, and then try to set people up for success instead of setting them up for failure. So try to, get people into circumstances where the situation is supportive of their meeting your trust.
Yeah.
If you can do that, that's a kind of awesome power to have. And it's a really, I think, good way of trusting is not to kind of assume that, or really, if we really easily assume that people are independent of their situational influence. And so anytime they let down our trust, it's just because, they didn't care enough about the commitment that they made to us. And I think that's kind of a danger. And so to be able to find the circumstances that are, or the situations that are supportive of people maintaining their commitments is a great thing to be able to do as a trustor.
Yeah, that's really nice. I mean, it's something you bring up in a couple of different ways in the paper, this in connection with like Philip Pettit's stuff, with Victoria McGear's stuff, this idea that like we can trust people in ways that make them more likely to prove trustworthy. And some of these ways are maybe verging on manipulative, like the one that Pettit suggests,
Yeah.
but others are not. And at the very least, we shouldn't trust people and then like make it harder for them to prove trustworthy.
I think that's right. So there are all these different mechanisms. And so one is the one that you raised that I think is really interesting, the self-concept mechanism. This is another thing that I learned from a paper of yours, which is the idea that we can sort of cultivate self-concept of trustworthiness in other people, and that's kind of self-reinforcing. To have our trustees think of themselves as the sort of people who keep their commitments in various domains, and that's a self-reinforcing mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's like sort of doing people a favor in a way that helps them do us favors, I guess. To change the topic slightly, one thing I wanted to raise with you, which is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of your paper, but which I've been wrestling with for a while now, is this idea that trust shouldn't be conceived of in dyadic terms with like, I'm a trustor, you're a trustee, but often in more sort of competitive terms. So I have to choose whether to trust you or someone else.
Oh, yeah.
Because in many cases, if I choose to trust you, there's someone else who's telling me the opposite. And I thereby end up not trusting them or even distrusting them. And I guess we see this kind of dramatized recently with this whole ivermectin catastrophe.
Exactly like ivermectin, that's crazy. Yeah.
So you have on the one hand, like the medical establishment saying, look, there's a range of vaccines, all of which are safe and effective, please take them. And then these grifters who come along and say like, you should take the horse dewormer. And there are people who like, you can't do, I guess you could do both. Like, I guess you could get vaccinated and take the horse.
Probably very few people who do though, right?
There's almost no one who does both.
Yeah.
So it's like, by choosing to trust one, you automatically at least don't trust the other, and in many cases distrust the other, or in more sort of ugly scenarios, it's like, well, I know I don't trust this person, so anyone who disagrees with them, I will trust.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing, at least in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, are driven by the uglier dynamic. I mean, there was just a report in The Guardian today that the import of ivermectin to Australia has gone up like 400% in the last few weeks. So there are people here who are also doing this stupid shit.
Yeah. I'm Canadian. In Alberta, there's been a run on ivermectin from veterinarians. Right. So it's crazy that you bring this up, because really I've been thinking about exactly this ivermectin case the last couple of days. And I've been thinking about, so in the context of people saying that our main problem is that we have a lack of trust, or we've got distrust, but then of the scientific community, which I think is true, or of science, which is true. But on the other hand, it's not these people who choose to take ivermectin over a vaccine are, in some sense, choosing to trust their own experts about what is safe and effective. And that, I mean, that's an incredible leap of trust. That's an incredible trusting thing to do, where, you know, you find these very marginal experts whose views are, you know, completely unsupported by all of the institutions of mainstream science, and you decide that you're going to trust them. That seems like a huge leap of trust. And so, I mean, that made me think, like, these people are really the trusting ones, the one who are even more trusting than the people who take the vaccines. But then, so that was my first thought. But then my second thought was, is it really out of desperation that people reach to something like ivermectin, where, you know, you're in that kind of situation where you feel that you're in a situation of just pervasive danger and pervasive deception, and, you know, you want to, and these people are interested in saving their lives and saving the lives of people that they care about. It seems to me like it must be an incredible act of desperation to go for something as far-fetched as this. And so they really are fundamentally more, they're desperate and distrusting, rather than just trusting, or even trusting, even more trusting, but of a different group. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so you might think if someone just doesn't take things seriously, they wouldn't take anything. They wouldn't get a vaccine. They wouldn't go out of their way to get stuff that's meant for deworming horses. They would stay, you know, just go about their lives. So the fact that they're going out of their way to do this thing, which is either illegal or at least highly inadvisable, to take things that are meant for non-human animals, that
it must feel really dangerous, right? I mean,
it must feel under a lot of threat. Yeah. But it's confusing to me, because it's like, if someone wanted to take advantage of you, they would be trying to get money or trying to get power or something. And the fact that, at least in the US and also here in Australia, the vaccines are free suggests like, well, that's not the motivation. So what is it? And then people kind of tell themselves crazy stories about microchips, or you know, the mark of the beast, or like things like that, in order to create at least a perceived incentive on the part of people who are administering vaccines to do something for their own advantage. And I don't know, it seems like there's that, but there's also some people, at least, who seem to think like it's best if they can just sort of be the clever ones who found a way, like a loophole or a way around the ordinary normie thing to do, and they do it in
Right.
their own special way. I
Yeah.
think there's something like that going on, at least in some cases.
There might be. Although, I mean, for me, the hydrochloroquine and the ivermectin cases seem really different from each other, because like ivermectin is a drug for horses, and it just, I mean, I'm thinking if
And it deals with the
uh,
digestive tract, not with the lungs.
exactly
It's like
right,
completely irrelevant.
right, it's totally relevant, and it just feels to me like such a dangerous thing to do, to get a medicine that's designed for a completely different species, which is what led me to think that maybe it's just like pure desperation that leads some people to trust these marginal figures telling them to take ivermectin over the vaccine. You must be, one, pretty afraid of the virus in the first place to take this kind of risk. So you're already in like a position of fear. You take it pretty seriously, and then you do something that is extraordinarily risky, um, in order to like, secure your safety from this thing. And this makes me think that like this is a position of just incredible wariness, distrustfulness, and desperation. But I don't know, we'd have to interview some more of these people. And
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the story is also the structure of the media, right? So ivermectin has been sort of promoted by right-wing media such as Fox News for months now.
yeah,
And Fox is kind of notorious for telling people, don't trust anyone other than us. So this is the last thing I wanted to bring up, is this issue of meta trust, which in the course we'll deal with in a few weeks. But this idea that in many cases, we don't just trust people to do things or not do things. We don't just trust people to tell us the truth, but we also trust people to tell us who else we can trust.
mm,
So you could call that meta trust or second order trust or something like that. And it seems like in many cases, people who end up accepting conspiracy theories or doing really self-harming things like taking ivermectin instead of a vaccine have had their attitudes warped by meta trust. So they start out trusting Fox News because it tells them, you know, that it's okay not to like immigrants or something. And then Fox also tells them, oh, you shouldn't get vaccinated, you should take ivermectin. And you shouldn't trust your doctor who tells you that you should get vaccinated.
right.
And then you get this situation where both the first order and the second order level, things get really warped, and people end up doing stuff that isn't even beneficial to themselves from a purely self-interested point of view, but quite self-harming.
Yeah. So this use of meta trust is not, so sometimes when people talk about meta trust, I think maybe Jones talks about meta trust this way. Meta trust is trust or distrust of your own trusting attitudes, right? And so their meta distrust is about, so if you've had the experience of being betrayed, and it's a very painful betrayal, you might not trust your own inclinations to trust anymore. But so that's a different issue. This is trusting people about which other people to trust.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is interesting, and it's, I mean, one thing to kind of notice about that is how easily our notions of who to trust and not to trust can be kind of warped by just insinuation. And so someone who, I mean, I think Trump is really good at this, where he sees a kind of a seed of distrust in people, and then he just knows how to feed that with insinuation. You know, the famous speech he does about some of them, I'm sure, are good people, but they're not sending their best. Where he doesn't say anything.
That was his very
Correct.
first one when he was campaigning, right? About
Right.
Mexican immigrants, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And So they're just like finding the seeds of extant distrust on the part of people, and then knowing how to nurture those seeds through indirect means and insinuation. I think it's just like such the tactic of dictators and populists and authoritarians. It's really a common go-to method of like warping people's sense of trust by finding the seeds of suspicion and just cultivating those seeds of suspicion. I think that Fox News is also really good at that kind of thing.
It's interesting. The metaphor of seeds is striking because, as you probably know, Mencius, the Chinese philosopher, has this idea that virtues start out as seeds and get cultivated. And it's interesting to think that there are also these seeds of vice that can be cultivated in sometimes similar, analogous ways.
Yeah. Distrust is really dangerous that way, and our distrusting attitudes are really dangerous that way. They can be quite easily manipulated and warped.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that you raise in the paper, that they can sort of be self-confirming and create these pernicious equilibria where all of a sudden, because people have been distrusting in certain ways, it starts to become reasonable to distrust in those ways.
Right.
And yeah, getting out of those pernicious equilibria and breaking into better ones is something we can all hope for, but I guess the last 2 years have made me pretty pessimistic.
Yeah, I can't blame you at all in your pessimism. But yeah, these equilibria are very powerful, and disturbing these equilibria. So I mean, and I think honestly, I think a problem with the paper is that looking back on it, the suggestions that I make for disturbing these equilibria are all really directed to the individual, and they're all about, how can I be a better truster? How can I be a sort of truster who is alive to the moral stakes of distrust, which is, and that's one important question to ask. But then there's much more sort of systemic questions about distrust equilibria in societies. And in some ways, I think those are probably the more important questions, and the more difficult questions, and maybe a place where it would be very fruitful to going forward.
Great. Well, that's a nice note to end on. So thank you so much for your time, Jason. I really appreciate it. And I hope you get some rest soon. I guess it's pretty late there.
It is. It's going on 10:30. Not too bad. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. And the questions have really made me think and made me kind of excited about these ideas again. So appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks.